Hello and welcome to our Center for the Arts studio for this edition of the AU Eagle Eye. I'm your host, Justin Davis, and we are joined today by writer, editor, professor, and fellow pilgrim, Joe Mackel. Joe, thanks for joining us, man.
Sure, Justin. Happy to be here, man.
So, you're a very big figure in the English department here at Ashland. You're a co-founder of River Teeth. You're an author of many pieces, and you're a very valuable professor. So when did your passion for writing start?
I would say I knew by the time I was 10 years old that I wanted to write. And I actually wrote something at 10 that was hideous, and it was a direct ripoff of some kind of Hardy Boys book. But mainly just because I read so much and I knew I wanted to do that. Saul Bellow, the famous Nobel Prize winner, said that writers are readers moved to emulation. And I think that's really true. The more I read, the more I just wanted to be a writer.
So who is your favorite writer, and what is your favorite piece?
My wife makes fun of me because I have 1,000 books in my top 5. But there are a couple of people who, when I was young, Ernest Hemingway really got there. For the last 20 years, 30 years, it's William Styron, who died about a decade ago. My favorite book of his is Sophie's Choice. But he just seems to be able to, his prose just kind of crawls under the skin of my soul somehow, even though we're very different. He's a generation older. He grew up in the Tidewater, Virginia in the South, and we don't share much, except there's something about his work that gets to me like nobody else's.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Ernest Hemingway, and that's a writer that I've had a lot of experience reading. And people tend to note that his writing style is simplistic. How would you comment on that, and how would you describe his writing style?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you stack him up against, like, Faulkner, who was practically a contemporary, who wrote long, lyrical, twisted, difficult sentences, Hemingway seems to have had a pretty simple style. But it was simple, it was simple to read, but it's because Hemingway was such a good writer. And a lot of people imitate Hemingway and find out just how hard it is to do. But he influenced journalism, he influenced a lot of fields just by writing in a more direct way that some people call simple, but I would call, like, deceptively simple. It's not as simple as it looks.
You talk about his impact on journalism. You have experience writing as a journalist. What have you done in the field?
Well, when I got out of college, there was a recession on in the early 80s, and I had an English degree, and I didn't have any money. And a lot of my friends who were in engineering were getting jobs left and right. So I've always been interested in journalism, and I read newspapers a lot, magazines, and I just thought, hey, they pay people to write, so I would do it. And even though I never had a journalism class in my life, as a matter of fact, like I told you before we came on air, I was never in a journalism class until I taught one here. And the same was true of my predecessor, Dan Lehman. All our degrees are in English up through the PhD, but journalists paid people to write, and there was no more fun place to be than a newsroom. And I just got into it and just found out how much I loved to do it. What I didn't love doing is being called out of bed at 2 o'clock in the morning to go cover a fire or something. So after a while, I decided to go back to school and get a few degrees.
So you've been on both sides of the fence, both as a journalistic writer and a literary writer. How would you compare the two types of writing styles?
Well, I think, newspapers have gone through a huge change now because of the internet. But for a while there, the reason Dan Lehman and I started River Teeth was because we never really saw much of a difference between the best literary journalism was every bit is every bit as literary as realistic fiction, you know? And we just decided that, I mean, we just saw more similarities between journalism and like creative writing or literary writing and journalistic writing, to use your term, than we saw differences. And we wanted to bring those two together in this journal. And some of my favorite writers are literary journalists.
So you mentioned River Teeth. It was a journal of nonfiction narrative
Yeah.
that you co-founded and co-edited. What went into the decision to do that and to display that type of writing?
Well, there was only one other nonfiction journal at the time, creative nonfiction, that started in 1994. And we started in 99, so next year will be 20 years for us. But we just wanted to find a place where creative writers and journalists could be together. And then there was this explosion in nonfiction at the same time. So we ended up really publishing essays, memoir, literary journalism, and some critical pieces on nonfiction, literary nonfiction. And that's basically how it started. We didn't put much thought into it. It was more like, hey, let's start a journal. And we did, and we got a little money from the university, and we just started doing it, never knowing if we were going to get a submission or a subscription or anyone would be interested. But we did put together a really good editorial board with a couple of Pulitzer Prize winners, just because at a little college in the middle of Ohio, we knew we needed a good editorial board in order to have people trust us. So we were able to put together a great editorial board, and that just kind of launched us, and we happened to be at the right place at the right time.
So a question that always stuck in my mind is, what does River Teeth come from? What does that mean?
If you look at the very first issue, there's a little essay, it's on our website too, little essay by David James Duncan, and I called him to ask if we could use River Teeth for the name of our journal, because he has a book whose title is River Teeth. And he grew up in the Northwest, and there used to be, when a tree falls into the river up there and decomposes, everything is washed away, but there was always these really hard knots of wood from the tree that would sink to the bottom, and they didn't dissolve, they didn't decompose, they just stayed there, and some of them became like rock hard as glass even. And David Duncan called those things river teeth. And then he thought about, as far as literature, he thought of, you know, so much of what happens in our lives gets washed away. We forget it, or we're not sure it's important. But then there are the things that kind of defy decomposition. Some little memory that you have that you can't get rid of. One thing some woman told you 30 years ago that you still think about. And a lot of those are the river teeth, and those are the kind of things, metaphorically, that we wanted for our journal. And then David Duncan sent me like a whole box of literal river teeth. I should have brought one in to show you. I have a bunch of them. But so that's what we did, and it's worked really well since then.
So how does a writer become a part of it?
Just write something really good. I mean, we get probably 2,500 submissions a year, and we publish 25 pieces a year.
Wow.
So that's just about 1%. So it's a hard place to get published, but we've published Pulitzer Prize winners, but we've also we published a senior in college. It was her first ever publication. It was just good enough. But Dan and I make all those decisions, and we just trust our instincts and how much we've read, and Dan's like one of the best readers I know.
So speaking of publications, you have a few of your own. The Last Street Before Cleveland was a more personal book written by yourself. What was the message that you were trying to convey in that story?
Well, there was a friend of mine who died of an accidental overdose at 38. They found him in a used car lot. He would take showers in the back. The guy let him take showers, and then he'd sleep in the car. And he was 38 years old, and he died. And I just figured, it bugged me that, I mean, he was a good kid. He just had a problem with drugs and alcohol, but also a problem fitting in the world, it seemed. And I just thought, no one writes a book about a guy like this. And so I wanted to. And it just drew me back to the old neighborhood. And I realized I was there at the same age my mother was when she died, and realized that maybe the book was less about Tom and more about finding out what the hell I was doing and why I felt drawn to the old neighborhood so much.
How long did it take you to write that?
It took a couple of years, but once I found out what it was really about, it was very quick.
And what's the process like for writing a book? Like, do you have a set plan or structure?
For that book, I just let it all come out and then went back to find out what it really is about. It's just like I told you in class. I'm a big believer in regurgitating a draft so you can find out what it is you really want to write about, and then look at what you've written and see what's there. In Plain Secrets, it was very different because I knew I was writing about this Amish family, and I knew them well, and that's why I had got access to telling their story, because they're the most conservative of all Amish, the Schwarzentroopers. And mine was the first book on the Schwarzentroopers, but I just had a really good source. But in that one, I knew I wanted to tell the story of one of their nephews who took off and didn't want to be Amish anymore, tried to become English, and then alternating with chapters of just how this family lived. So that one was more controlled, and they're both first-person books, but in the second one, I was in it more as a guide to the Amish world, not as a participant the way I was in The Last Street Before Cleveland.
How do you feel like the Amish are represented in culture, American culture?
I think we generally stereotype the Amish and generalize about them. And what I found out about the Amish is to generalize about them is to be a fool, because they're not a monolithic group of people. They're very, very different. They have many sects and orders, and you can't generalize about them. You got to take them as we take most people, one at a time.
So what was your connection to a main character in the story, Samuel? Who was he in the novel?
Samuel's a man I know really well. I met him, he moved into a house about a mile from me that was an English house, and all of a sudden one day I'd see the toilet was outside, and he was getting rid of all this stuff that he didn't need anymore. And I would just wave to him when I went by, and he started waving, and then we wanted to get a horse for our daughter for 8th grade graduation, and we asked if we could keep it at his house, and that's how we met. But even from there, it took me, I'd talk to him about a book once in a while, but it still took at least a decade of knowing him before he felt that he could trust me enough to write this book.
So out of the pieces that we've discussed in the last Street Before Cleveland and Plain Secrets and all the other pieces that you've written, what do you think is your most successful piece, or the one that you're most proud of writing?
I think I'm kind of more into what I'm writing right now, but I'm glad I really had to write Last Street, and every day I'd go to my Amish friend's house, and I just remember thinking, if you don't write about these people, you're an idiot. And you can never call yourself a writer because it's such a great story. So I'm proud of that book, and it was a Book of the Month Club selection, and it got good reviews, and I still get letters from people asking me about that book, so it must have touched a chord with them.
So you mentioned you're writing something right now. Can you give us a snippet of maybe what that's about, or when we'll see it?
Well, I'm not sure when you'll see it, but I'm going to finish it this summer. Suddenly, when I became a grandfather almost 10 years ago now, I went a little crazy. Suddenly I felt like worried about the world and what kind of a country I was leaving those kids, and then I started wondering what we owe our ancestors and how much of them we carry in us, and it's just, the book right now is kind of a mess because I'm trying to balance all these different things, but I'm comfortable with the chaos of the book right now. and I feel like I'm closing in on something.
Well, thank you so much, Joe, for joining us. If you have not already purchased and read The Last Street Before Cleveland, Plain Secrets, An Outsider Among the Amish, and River Teeth, if you're interested in impactful literature from the mind of Joe Macko, as that concludes today's Glance Through the Eagle Eye, I'm your host, Justin Davis, saying God bless and thanks for tuning in.